Like many of you watching this channel, I'm a toy fan, and I'm a toy collector. And I suppose it all started in my childhood being a toy player, a kid who plays with toys. Do they even have a term for that? I guess they just call them kids. This is not me. This is just a picture I found on Google. But yes, I was like this kid. I was a huge fan and player of the old Kenner Star Wars line. Ah, those vintage figures. So many memories of losing them in the snow and finding them in the spring when my father would run over them with the lawnmower. Having my parents paint the bottoms with lipstick so that I could tell which one was mine and which was my friend's. Not lipstick, nail polish. Lipstick would come right off. Anyway, the vintage line had a lot going for it and a lot of memories. And one of the interesting things, here we are, somewhat 30 to 40 years plus after it, and we still can't decide how many figures were released. I mean, we have that whole Collect 92 thing that people say all the time, and you can buy, t-shirts that say this. And even Hasbro recently has been started referring to it as the 96, using fun, cool Kenner-esque font to express the fact that they want to complete the 96 in the vintage collection, which would be nice, especially since there are several figures in the original releases that have never come out. So, how many are there? How many Star Wars toys were released in the 80s? And why is it that after all this time, we still can't come up with a definitive answer? Well, a lot of it's going to depend on your definition. What's the definition of is, as a former president would say. All right, I'm not talking politics here. Let's talk toys, and let's talk history of toys. Because if we're going to get to the bottom of this and figure out exactly how many vintage Star Wars toys were made and how many more Hasbro has to do in order to finish the line, well, we got to dig deep. So let's start with the original Kenner toy card backs. This was kind of the birth of the Crosscell. Crosscells were really big in the 80s and 90s. They've kind of gone away of late, especially for legal reasons. They don't want to show toys that, for one reason or another, may not come out because, that's going to piss off fans and kids and gift givers. So the original Kenner Crosscell, it grew over time. Well, it started as illustrations of the original figures that came out in 78, since they couldn't even get figures out in 77 because, reasons. It grew over time, especially as the sequel movies came out. And by that I mean, the sequels to Star Wars, A New Hope, the original film, meaning Empire and Jedi, not the sequel trilogy like the Disney movies. So eventually we bumped up to collecting all 41, and as more and more figures got released, they would continue to update the cross-cell on the back to show a total number of figures. And this was really cool. I mean, can you imagine figure lines now showing all of the characters you could possibly get in a line? Gosh, I mean, some of the toy lines, heck, the current Hasbro Star Wars line, I can't even imagine the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands. So we're going from 41 to 48. We're still building, and we're still keeping track of all of the different characters on this awesome cross-cell, eventually switching over to this yellow background that was also used with superpowers. It kind of became the official Kenner background color for cross-cells, which is kind of neat. And then when Jedi starts coming out, we bump up to 65 figures. And then finally, we top it off at the very end. The last releases, especially at least in the US, counted the total as, not 77, here we are, 92. So here's where we get the Collect 92. When Power of the Force was done, the coins, the whole shebang, 92 figures. All right. So that's where we get our collect all the 92 from. But even if you do the hand count in this image, you're going to get 93 figures. So collect 92 is kind of out the door right away, because if we're defining original figures in the Kenner line as single carded releases, 92 doesn't even come close to defining that, even though that's what it said on the back of the package. So let's keep counting and let's figure out how many we're going to get to. Is it Hasbro's 96, or are they off? So the most obvious one to add is Yak Face. Yak Face, or Salik Marek, these new names are always hard to pronounce. This figure was only released overseas and in Canada, meaning not in the US. And this is very common for 80s toy lines because the European market usually lags behind about a year, almost 2 years after the US market. And a lot of toy lines, like Masters of the Universe as an example, the final product that doesn't hit the US is shipped to Europe because for Europe, they're still behind and they're still on a property even when the US is off of a property, meaning retailers. So once retailers drop a property, what's called delisting, the European toy market and sometimes Canadian, are still carrying it. Same thing happened with Secret Wars, the Mattel line of Marvel figures. The final wave only shipped overseas. All right, so that's what happened with Yak Face, and he's clearly a carded figure. Now we have to talk about some droids, and specifically we have to talk about our little buddy R2-D2, because how do we count how many R2-D2s were released in the vintage line? Well, we can start by looking at how many unique carded R2-D2s were there, and are we counting these as unique versions of R2, or are these just upgrades, redecos, improvements? So we had our original R2, and then as each new film came out, we got a brand new R2, or sort of brand new, with a different feature. This one being the one for Empire Strikes Back that got a pop-out sensor scope, and was actually the one I had as a kid. And then for Jedi, although released in the Power of the Force line, was the pop-up lightsaber R2. So how do we count all these? Well, they all had single card releases, and they all had unique cards that reflected card art from their particular movie. So although the Empire Strikes Back R2 noted with a burst that he was now with sensor scope, although that really isn't the sensor scope, that's actually the little scope from Dagobah, I have the wrong image. And then the Power of the Force figure had the pop-out lightsaber. Those are unique figures, even though they weren't called that on the 92. C-3PO went through something similar. He had his original release with just the VAC metallized, and then an updated release where he not only got an accessory of a bag for Chewbacca to carry around on his back or do his shopping for ice cream and ice cream makers in Cloud City, but he also had another action feature with pop-out limbs that the original release didn't. So two different carded versions, one for Star Wars A New Hope, which was just Star Wars back then, and then one for The Empire Strikes Back, showing him bundled up on Chewbacca's back to go out for a nice picnic. So, clearly two different versions of C-3PO, right? I mean, it's the same figure, but updated features. All right, we're not done with R2-D2 yet, though, because even though he had 3 different carded releases, there were other versions of R2-D2 released. So one of the more notorious ones was the R2 that came with the Droid Factory playset, which was kind of like supposed to be like a Jawa inside the Sandcrawler-ish playset thing. It was sort of expanded universe, but it came with everything you see here, and it came with the parts to make several droids, some that were in the movie and some that were clearly not in the movie. But the notorious one was that you could construct an R2-D2 that had the third leg, or third leg, that's what they call it. It's the only vintage figure of R2 that you could get like this, but it's absolutely a 3 3/4 figure. Then, of course, there was the wind-up walking R2-D2 that had the action feature of movement, because he could, move like any other wind-up toy from the 80s. And he was more or less in scale to a 3 3/4 figure. So that begs to ask the question, how many R2-D2s were released in the vintage line as action figures, and how do we count them? Which ones count, which ones don't? All right, well, looking at the modern line as a source of comparison and a source of sort of a foundational argument, there were quite a few R2-D2s released in the modern line. There's ones with hologram Leias, there's ones with jetpacks, there's ones with little worm accessory things, there's ones with lights and sounds that have batteries inside of them, there's ones that come with drinks so he could get all of your sail barge characters drunk, and there are droids and characters that come with playsets or vehicles, and the modern collector tends to count these as legitimate figures, original figures. So with that basis and essentially, rationale, the Droid Factory R2-D2 to me certainly seems like a legitimate variant. He didn't come on a basic card, but he's a different version. The wind-up one, that's a whole nother argument, because, you could make the argument that this is just an action feature. After all, modern Star Wars toys have had action features, And modern collectors do count them legitimately as 3 3/4 figures, not some other line or some other subline that they don't count as a complete collection. We've had light up figures, we've had figures with secret battle features, because Anakin, yeah, secret battle features. His arm gets cut off, spoiler alert. And we have had wind-up figures in the modern line. Not too many, but even for the Han Solo movie, recently there was a 2-pack of wind-up figures only sold at Disney, but they were in scale to the 3 3/4 figures, and these droids did appear in the movie as kind of battling droids, and they had wind-up features. So does that make wind-up a legitimate action feature? Well, a lot of people don't see that. A lot of people see wind-up as a novelty toy. What about this one? What about the size Snoodles and the Max Rebo Band? These were 3 3/4 figures. They just happened to come in a large, oversized box with additional accessories. Max Rebo there coming with his organ and microphone and et cetera, that they had. They were completely compatible with the rest of the figures. They just weren't sold individually on cards. So are we only counting figures again that are on cards? Well, by modern standards, figures that come packed in with things, that come packed with vehicles, that come packed with larger accessories, with deluxe lines. I mean, do you count these figures that was a 2-packs of Max Rebo Band figures in the modern line? There were actually several of these, I think 3 in total. So again, do they have to be single-carded figures, or double-carded, or triple-carded count? It's starting to give you a headache. It's starting to give me a headache. And what about Jabba the Hutt? I mean, he's a intelligent speaking character with a large role in the film. Now, you could say he doesn't count as a basic figure because he's so large. He could never be sold on a basic card. Is he more of a beast like the Rancor, which just, growls, and could you say it's intelligent enough to be a person? Or the same thing with the Wampa. It's not that much larger than Luke, smaller than Jabba, and again, he just growls and makes noises. And, if that's your definition, then do you even count something like Walrus Man as a legitimate character? Because he only makes growling noises. So do you go by intelligence? Do you go by basic card? Where do you draw the line? Well, I think everyone agrees Jabba is a deluxe figure. So what about Variance, though? I mean, there were 2 different Ugnaughts, purple and blue. Han had Variance, Lando had Variance. Sometimes you saw his teeth, sometimes you didn't. Yoda had multiple colored snakes. The Imperial officer had different paint jobs. There are no end to paint variants in the vintage line. Luke went through several different types of lightsabers, several different types of hair color, and having to keep track and say these are unique figures, well, that's hard to define. What I think you can say is if a figure gets a brand new head, it's a different figure. So not sure many people count this, but when I look at the 2 Han Solos, because they sculpted an entirely different head, if you're going to use the modern figures as comparison and as sort of your measurement tool, well, let's look at ceremonial Luke. The first ceremonial Luke that we got was a basic carded one, then we got a 30th anniversary one, and the 30th anniversary one had a brand new head and released in the vintage line. But otherwise, it was the exact same figure. So, by those standards, well, actually, I think it came with a different gun. But the point is, it's the same figure with a different head. It's no different than that Han Cantina figure, or A New Hope Han, if you will, from the vintage line. He just got a new head. But otherwise, it was the same figure. So, if we count the ceremonial Luke as a unique figure, do we count him? Do we start digging into the color of Yoda's snake and how much of Lando's teeth we can see? Where do you draw the line? I mean, if you're going to just go with color variants, don't even talk about Hoth Han, because between the pants, the skin tone, the gun color, there are so more variants of this figure than I think any other, and it would just give you a headache trying to collect them all and saying legitimately these are different figures that should be counted in the overall figure count. Which is why it all comes down to definition. Are we saying single-carded figures? Well, in that case, it's definitely not 92 because Yak Face was a single-carded figure. And the R2 and 3PO variants aren't counted in this 92. And they were clearly carded and they were different figures. They had new parts, new sculpting, and completely different cards. So, all right, 92 plus Yak Face, 93, plus R2-D2 from the factory, 94, R2-D2 95 with the sensor scope, 96 with the pop-out lightsaber, C-3PO 97 with the limbs, 98, 99, 100 for the Max Rebo Band 3-pack, just because they weren't on a single card. Again, we've had double cards. And then Han Solo with a completely different sculpted head, just like Ceremonial Luke. I guess that brings our grand total of vintage Star Wars figures to 101. There you go. Collect all 92, collect the 96. I say collect 101. At least if you're going to use the modern line and the way collectors define legitimate different figures. There's always going to be paint differences. And, you know, Hasbro still has their work cut out because there's a few figures from the vintage line that they haven't even redone in the last 35 years of modern figures. Come on, where's my Slimaloo, Hasbro? Make it happen. We want to finish this already. So, if you're a collector of the vintage collection or the retro collection or the old figures, I don't know what we call them, all these names, they overlap, vintage, retro, original, whatever it is, Hasbro, you still got some work ahead of you because we want all of the figures from the original line, and that includes the mustache guard, it includes the Imperial Dignitary, and I think we still have some work to do. But I'm going with 101. What do you think? How do you count your Star Wars figures? If you like this video and want to see more like it, please do subscribe and give it a like. It tells YouTube to share it with more people, and that's what it's all about, sharing toy love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.